He was born in Parma, Ohio in 1928 and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He grew up fascinated with rockets, but his family could not afford to send him to the elite colleges that taught rocketry. He went instead to the Naval Academy, settling, he thought, for aviation instead of outer space. He flew twice during Project Gemini and twice in Apollo, and was on his way to the moon when an oxygen tank deep in the heart of his spacecraft exploded. He is James Lovell, and he is a legend of air power. James A. Lovell was born outside of Cleveland in Parma, Ohio on March 25, 1928. His family moved soon after to Milwaukee. His father died when he was only 12. Lovell and his mother, left alone, formed a tight-knit family unit that scraped by.
Lovell was fascinated by rocketry, and as a student in high school, he actually built a rocket with the help of some friends and a chemistry professor. And he launched the rocket, and it did indeed fly about 80 feet up in the air, whereupon it exploded into what he described as a fabulous suicide.
As the years passed, Lovell's interest in rocketry did not wane. Entranced by the experiments of rocket pioneer Robert Goddard, he wanted to be a rocket engineer.
I wrote to G. Edward Pendray, who was the secretary of the American Rocket Society in 1946, as I was graduating from high school. He said, fine, go to MIT or Caltech. Well, I couldn't afford any of those things.
Turned down by the Naval Academy, Lovell instead joined the ROTC and entered the University of Wisconsin. He studied there for 2 years, reapplied to Annapolis, and this time got in.
My first desire when I got out of high school was to follow rocketry and just become an engineer. Aviation was my second goal, and I really wanted to fly. And you always should have second goals. If you can't get the first thing, always look at the second thing.
The Navy in the wake of World War II was changing. The battleships no longer reigned supreme. When the time came, Lovell applied for flight training, was admitted, and earned his wing. The Navy assigned him to night fighter training in California. In 1956, flying a mission at night off the carrier Shangri-La in the Sea of Japan, Lovell homed in a Japanese radio station instead of the ship's beacon and got lost.
I had an E-pad that I had developed on the cruise over to Japan that would light up, and when I had it plugged to the ship's receptacle, and when I lit the E-pad up, it blew all the lights inside the airplane, all the cockpit lights out, completely dark. Couldn't believe it.
Lost, alone, out of radio contact with his home base, and unable to read his instruments, Lovell seemed doomed. Looking around, he saw the pale glow of luminescent plankton churned up by the screws of the Shangri-La. With the wife and small children back on shore, Lovell followed the dim line, hoping it would lead to the Shangri-La. It did. He drove his plane down on the deck so hard, it blew two tires.
The skipper of my team, very, very smart individual, put me on the very next flight. The next night, launched me off again. And that was the best thing in the world that happened to me.
Soon after, Lovell requested assignment to the Navy's test pilot school at NAS Patuxent River in Maryland. He graduated first in his class and stayed at Pax River for 4 years. He was assigned to test aircraft electronic systems, which involved a lot of flying in circles, painting different things on the plane's radar.
Now, there are 4 test divisions at that time at Pax River. Flight test, service test, armament test, electronics test. Everybody who graduates from test pilot school wants to go to flight test. You check out all the performances of the aircraft, what it can do. Service test is not bad because you run the airplane and run it until find out what breaks, what goes wrong. Armament test, well, it's pretty good. You find out how to drop the bombs and fire the rockets and shoot the guns. Electronics test? I mean, all you do is circle small cities around and check out the electronics and the radar and things like that. That's the last thing I wanted to do. That's the first thing I got.
In the aviation community, the hot topic was the inevitability of space exploration. The Russians had launched Sputnik, and the new American space agency, NASA, had announced Project Mercury. Lovell got orders to report to Washington for what was referred to as Spec Ops. When he arrived, he found himself in a room with more than 100 other pilots. Spec Ops training turned out to be the first stage of astronaut recruitment.
We went looking for possible candidates in a variety of areas, and there were certain possibilities. Some people suggested they should be race car drivers. They would have the right kinds of skills, and once again, coolness under pressure and so forth. They would be used to be taking a lot of risks. So there was some reason for that. But when you start looking around seriously, since flying in space is an adjunct of flying in the air, it makes a lot of sense to go look for pilots. And the ones who were doing high-speed performance flying were all in the Air Force, so that's where we ended up going. Or I shouldn't say just the Air Force, but the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines.
This, to me, was almost the epitome of what I really wanted to do. I couldn't be a rocket engineer. I got into the Navy. I got into aviation. And then suddenly what I wanted to do and where I was, because I had the right credentials to get into this program, met.
32 pilots passed through to the next stage, medical testing. Lovell seemed to be cruising through that until a lab test detected high levels of an obscure chemical in his blood. The elevated levels might mean something, or they might not. On a tight schedule with no time to investigate, the doctors sent Lovell home.
Talk about a disillusioned young man, a naval officer, couldn't believe it. I was the only one out of 32 people that they flunked.
He returned to Pax River and his consolation prize, the F-4H Phantom. The Phantom was both the fastest and slowest fighter in the sky, a highly maneuverable and slightly unstable aircraft that arrived with what was then a pretty impressive electronics package.
You know, complicated, integrated electronic weapons systems. And so we were able to do quite a bit with the airplane. Learned all about its radar. It was an interceptor. Learned all about its performance. Took it aboard a carrier. And so, great time.
The only electronics test pilot at PAX with substantial night fighter experience, Lovell was made project manager of the plane's flight tests. It was great work, but it wasn't outer space. 2 years after the first Mercury astronauts were announced, NASA put out word that it wanted more astronauts. Lovell reapplied, and his odd blood chemistry, which had washed him out of the first astronaut selection process, somehow seemed not such a big deal the second time around. In 1962, NASA announced that Lovell and 8 others were the second astronaut class.
I don't think we were too welcomed by the first group, and there was only 7 of those guys, and we were 9 of us. They took us aboard, but they were looking at, well, you're going to take our spots, and, of course, they were all senior.
Project Gemini, the follow-up to Mercury, was a series of 2-man flights designed to test systems and procedures necessary to land a man on the moon. Lovell was assigned to the backup crew on Gemini 4, which included the first American spacewalk. Lovell knew that after serving as backup, he was not far from going into space himself, and soon enough his number came up. He and Frank Borman would fly Gemini 7, a mission that, if all went as planned, would set a space endurance record.
He and Frank Borman were very hard-charging men, but they were also fairly easygoing. He and Frank were in a Gemini capsule, which was not exactly a spacious machine. In fact, somebody described it as being about as big as the back seat of a VW Beetle.
That didn't matter to Lovell, because it was the back seat of a Volkswagen in space, and space was where he wanted to be. The mission took off December 4th, 1965.
Frank and I were so close together that you couldn't stretch out. You could stretch your legs, but had to bend your torso, or you could straighten your torso, but then you had to bend your legs. And your top of your head was right at the top of the hatch. You know, for 2 weeks with Frank Borman in the spacecraft was a real challenge in itself.
They spent a lot of time joking with each other. Frank Borman would occasionally sing to Jim, "Put your sweet lips a little closer to the phone and we'll pretend that we're together all alone." And of course they were very much alone.
A lot of the medical community didn't think that man could stay in space for 2 weeks. And that was the maximum length of time to go to the moon and come back again. We had about 23 experiments. We were doing everything to check, you know, our blood volume and our heart rates, and they had all sorts, we were wired up for all sorts of things.
On the 11th day of the mission, Gemini 7 and Gemini 6 rendezvoused high above the Earth. The maneuver, slow and imprecise by modern standards, nonetheless proved that it was possible to synchronize orbits in a way that would allow a lunar landing craft to meet up with its orbiting command module.
Rendezvous and docking with 2 Gemini spacecraft in orbit, those were critical components of us being able to successfully land on the moon.
The mission was an overwhelming success. Lovell returned to Earth knowing that he had a good chance to be one of the astronauts chosen to go to the moon. After backing up Gemini 9, Lovell's next flight assignment was Gemini 12. The mission, flown by Lovell and Buzz Aldrin in 1966, closed Project Gemini with another rousing success. With the exception of a few minor mechanical failures, the flight accomplished its goals, and even the failures seemed encouraging. Assigned to dock with the Agena target vehicle without assistance from ground-based radar, Lovell succeeded even when his primary onboard radar failed. He switched without fuss to a backup system and docked right on schedule. Aldrin went for a spacewalk that proved that astronauts could not only float helplessly at the end of a tether, but they could also accomplish serious, challenging tasks in space. 94 hours after liftoff, Gemini 12 fired its retro rockets to return to Earth and plopped safely into the ocean less than 3 miles from its target. 28 minutes later, Lovell and Aldrin walked out onto the deck of the USS Wasp, and Project Gemini came to a close. Back at NASA, planners were getting nervous. There were rumors the Russians were planning a moonshot for 1968, and the lunar module, which would ferry 2 astronauts from lunar orbit to the moon's surface, was falling behind schedule. Apollo 8, Lovell's next mission, had been planned as a shakedown cruise for the lunar module in Earth orbit.
We had heard from intelligence that the Russians were going to put a man around the moon in 1968, and that was the decision that George Low had thought, well, maybe we can salvage Apollo 8 and send it to the moon and wait till Apollo 9 to test out the 2 spacecraft around the Earth. And that's how that all came to pass.
Apollo 8 and its mission without a lander became the first flight to orbit around the moon 10 times during December of 1968. It was really a very challenging and very intriguing mission to be on the backup crew, to be any part of that, because it was the first mission that was going to leave the Earth and reach the moon.
On December 21st, 1968, Lovell, Frank Borman, and William Anders took off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. After making a few checks, they fired their second stage and became the first people to leave Earth orbit.
As we were getting towards the end of our training for Apollo 8, already realizing that this was going to be a lunar flight because Apollo 7 was successful, we thought, what can we say around the moon? Because when we looked at our trajectory, we would burn into lunar orbit on Christmas Eve.
Their first thought was 'twas the night before Christmas, but the wife of a journalist suggested instead that they read from Genesis. In what is without question one of the most moving moments in human history, the first people to look at the moon close up pointed a tiny television camera at the lunar surface and took turns reading to the whole world from the Bible.
And for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on this good earth.
With 3 trips into space behind him, James Lovell showed no disappointment when he was not named to be among the first to land on the moon. His time, he knew, would come. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon, it completed what had been a kind of national obsession. From President Kennedy's audacious proclamation that the United States would put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s to the return of Apollo 11, the socially and politically polarized United States had been able to agree on little except the fascinating achievement of manned space travel. But once Armstrong, Aldrin, and Command Module pilot Michael Collins returned to Earth, some of the public excitement about space travel seemed to dissipate. Apollo 12 seemed like a rerun. And by the time of Lovell's next flight, Apollo 13, the public's attention had started to roam. On April 11, 1970, Lovell and his crewmates, Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes, lifted off. The mission was going well. Even mission control on the ground seemed blasé about man's third mission to the moon. The capsule seems in real good shape, Capcom Joe Kerwin said to the astronauts. We're bored to tears down here.
Take off on that flight? April 11th, 1970 at 13:13 Central Standard Time. We weren't superstitious, but maybe I should have been.
9 hours later, 200,000 miles from Earth, and outbound at a speed of nearly 25,000 miles, an oxygen tank in the spacecraft service module blew up, knocking out virtually all life support systems for the capsule.
We didn't know what happened at first. I looked at Hayes, and he didn't know what occurred. I looked at Jack Swigert, of course, and Jack was probably saying to himself, why am I on this flight? I was the backup.
It was essentially an also-ran of Apollo 11, and all of a sudden, when it looked like none of them thought they were going to get back alive.
No one had ever been in so much trouble so far from home. There were 3 men 90 hours from Earth, utterly dependent on the lunar module, a self-sufficient pod designed to support 2 men for only 45 hours.
We tried to close the hatch between the 2 vehicles, thinking that at first maybe a meteor had hit the vehicle. We weren't successful at closing that hatch, which of course is a requirement if you're going to make a safe landing back on Earth. But we tied the hatch down to a couch, and then looking at the symptoms that were occurring, because loss of all of our oxygen would mean loss of all of our electrical power, and then loss of our propulsion system.
To preserve power, they cut consumption by 80%. The temperature in the tiny spacecraft dropped to the point where hypothermia became a very real problem.
Lovell was the commander, and it was up to him to set the tone. It was up to him to keep everybody from going nuts. And certainly there were moments when none of them thought they were going to get back alive.
So we had to start using all those crisis management techniques and good leadership on the part of the ground people and teamwork to get together to try to determine out what was wrong and use our imagination to figure out how to take care of things.
On the ground, engineers calculated small maneuvers that would keep Apollo 13 on a course that would slingshot it around the moon and back toward Earth on what is called a free return course. The solution was an emergency manual burn, a procedure deemed so unlikely that the emergency manual documenting it had not been included on the flight in order to save weight. But Lovell had been involved in the development of the manual, and as Mission Control watched in Houston, he and his crewmates powered up the command module, burned its engine for 4.5 minutes, and got their craft online for Earth.
Then we thought everything was okay because we thought we were back on the free return course, and we had nothing going for us except the radio and a little fan to circulate the atmosphere. All the navigation aids, the guidance system, the computer, they were all shut down. Couldn't afford the electrical power. And then finally on the way home, ground tracking us said we were no longer on the free return course. and that we had missed the Earth's atmosphere for a safe landing if we kept on this course.
The pilot, who had once followed algae back to his aircraft carrier, aimed his spacecraft home using a primitive sighting device in the lunar module nicknamed the Exterminator. He had a margin of error for less than 1 degree in any direction. He nailed it.
And that was using the Earth's Terminator, the little gun sight we had in the lunar module window, to get in the proper position to use the lunar module engine to reestablish ourselves inside a very small 2-degree pie-shaped wedge to get us into the Earth's atmosphere, which we did by just brute force, no autopilot to help us stabilize the vehicles. And both Fred and I working in the spacecraft together, Jack doing the timing because even the clock was shut down. Got back in, of course, and the story, of course, is well known. We did make a safe landing in the Pacific Ocean, just about where we would have made the landing, but we arrived there several days early.
It was described by NASA after the fact as a successful failure. And it was certainly that. I would take it a step farther and say it was a miracle, and certainly a testament to the people at NASA and their ability to put their heads together, to work the problems, and to come up with solutions to an incredible situation and series of events that when you look back at it and you analyze everything that went wrong in Apollo 13, which started obviously with the oxygen tank bursting and taking out a healthy portion of the command module, and went on to the problems with carbon monoxide, the issues with the electrical system. When you put all that together and you consider the fact that these are 3 men who are exhausted, who are frightened, albeit trained to control that fright, but are certainly probably 75% convinced that they're not going to get home alive. You've got electrical failures, mechanical failures. The one thing you didn't have with Apollo 13 was human failures.
I look at it like now like a game of solitaire. You know, the game starts, you pick up a card. As long as you put that card someplace, the game continues. It's only when you pick up a card and there's no place to put it that the game ends. That never occurred on Apollo 13. We always had one more card that we could put someplace to keep the game going.